Poor Little Black Fellow by Langston Hughes, 2. Mr. Pemberton took Arnie to Boston once a season and bought him clothes. On his birthday they gave him a party, on the lawn, because after all, his birthday came in the spring and there was no need of filling the living room with children. There was much more room on the lawn. In summer, Arnie went to the seashore with the rest of the family. And Arnie, dark as he was, thrived. He grew up, he did well in his classes, he did well at home, helped with the chores about the house, raked the yard in the fall, and shoveled snow when the long winters set in. On Sundays, he went to church with the family, listened to a dry and intelligent sermon, chanted the long hymns, and loved the anthems in which Miss Emily sang the solo parts. Arnie in church, a little black spot in a forest of white heads above stiff pews. Arnie out of church, a symbol of how Christian charity should really be administered in the true spirit of the human brotherhood. The church and the Pembertons were really a little proud of Arnie. Did they not all accept him as their own? Did they not go out of their way to be nice to him, poor little black fellow, when they, through Christ, had taken in? Throughout the years, the whole of Mapleton began to preen itself on its charity and kindness to Arnie. One would think that nobody in the town need ever again do a good deed, that this acceptance of a black boy was quite enough. Arnie realized how they felt, but he didn't know what to do about it. He kept himself quiet and inconspicuous and studied hard. He was very grateful and very lonely. There were no other colored children in the town, but all the grown-up white people made their children be very nice to him, always very nice. Poor little black boy, they said, an orphan and colored, and the Pembertons are so good to him. Be nice to him too, do you hear? Share your lunch with him and don't fight him or hurt his feelings. He's only a poor little Negro who has no parents. And even the children were overkind to Arnie. Everything might have been all right forever had not Arnie begun to grow up. The other children began to grow up too. Adolescents. The boys had girls. They played kissing games and learned to dance. There were parties to which Arnie was not invited, really couldn't be invited, with the girls after all. And after generations of peace in the village of Mapleton, and the Pembertons found themselves beset with a Negro problem, everyone was a little baffled and a little ashamed. To tell the truth, everybody had got so used to Arnie that nobody really thought of him as a Negro until he put on long trousers and went to high school. Now they noticed that he was truly very black, and his voice suddenly became deep and mannish even before the white boys in Arnie's class talked in the cracks and squeaks of coming manhood. Then there had arisen the problem of the Boy Scouts. When Arnie was 16, the Pembertons applied for him to be admitted to a summer camp for the Scouts at Barrow Beach, and the camp had refused. In a personal letter, Mr. Pemberton said they simply could not admit in a personal letter to Mr. Pemberton, they said they simply could not admit Negroes. Too many parents would object. So several of Arnie's friends and classmates went off to camp in June, and Arnie could not go. The village of Mapleton and the Pembertons were awfully apologetic for American democracy's attitude to Arnie, whose father had died in the war. But after all, they couldn't control the Boy Scout camp. It was a semi-private institution. They were extra nice to Arnie, though. Everybody. That summer, the Pembertons bought him a bicycle, and toward the end of summer, because they thought it was dull for him at the bungalow, they sent him to a Negro charity camp near Boston. It would be nice for him to come to know some of his own people, but Arnie hated it. He stayed for a week and came home. The charity camp was full of black kids from the slums of Boston who cussed and fought and made fun of him because he didn't know how to play the dozens. So Arnie, to whom Negroes were a new nation, even if he was black, was amazed and bewildered and came home. The Pembertons were embarrassed to find him alone in his attic room in the big empty house when they and the servants returned from the beach. But they wanted so to be nice to him. They asked him if he'd met any friends he'd like to ask down for a weekend. They thought they would give him the whole top floor of the garage that year for a little apartment of his own, and he could have his colored friends there. But Arnie hadn't met anyone he wanted to have. He had no colored friends. The Pembertons knew that he couldn't move in the social world of Mapleton much longer. He was too big. But really, what could they do? Grace Pemberton prayed, Emily talked it over with the mission board of the church, and Mr. Pemberton spoke to the Urban League in Boston. Why not send him to Hampton now? Arnie had only one more year in the high school. Then, of course, he would go to college, but to one of the nicer Negro colleges, like Fisk, they decided. where those dear Jubilee singers sang so beautifully, and where he would be with his own people and wouldn't be embarrassed. No, Fisk wasn't as good as Harvard, they knew, but then Arnie had to find his own world after all. They'd have to let him go, poor black fellow. Certainly. He was their very own, but in Mapleton, what could he do? How could he live? Whom could he marry? The Pembertons were a bit worried, even, about this one more year, so they decided to be extra nice to him. Indeed, everybody in Mapleton decided to be extra nice to him. The 2 rooms over the garage made a fine apartment for a growing boy. His pennants and books and skis were there. Sometimes the white boys came in the evenings and played checkers and smoked forbidden cigarettes. Sometimes they walked out and met the girls at the soda fountain in Dr. Jourdain's drugstore, and Arnie had a soda with the group. But he always came away alone while the others went off in pairs. When the Christmas parties were being given, many of the girls were lovely in dresses that looked almost like real evening gowns, but Arnie wasn't invited anywhere but to the Allens, and they really didn't count in Mapleton. They were very poor white folks. The Pembertons were awfully sorry, of course. They were one of New England's oldest families, and they were raising Arnie as their son, but he was an African, a nice Christian African, and he ought to move among his own people. There he could be a good influence and have a place. The Pembertons couldn't help it that there were no Negroes in Mapleton. Once there had been some, but now they had all moved away. It was more fashionable to have white help, and even as a servant in Mapleton, Arnie would have been a little out of place, but he was smart in school and a good clean boy. He sang well. All Negroes were musical. He skated and swam and played ball. He loved and obeyed the Pembertons. They wanted him to find his place in the world. Poor fine little black fellow, poor dear Arnie. So it was decided that he would go to Fisk next year. When Arnie agreed, the Pembertons breathed a sort of sigh of joy. They thought he might remember the camp at Boston and not want to go to a Negro college. And we'll pause there.